Well, the rupee continuing its downward slide. The only silver lining is that inflation has dropped slightly in latest figures, the lowest this year. I spoke earlier to the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, in this exclusive interview. I began by asking him about the many numbers which have been talked about in the last week, all bad, from a drop to 6.9% in growth to dismal industrial output, the rupee in a downward spiral, silver lining from inflation. But is the government failing to recognize an economic crisis staring them in the face, setting aside the inflation point for the moment?
Well, I don't think you can call it an economic crisis, but I think the government does recognize that the economic news on several fronts is disappointing. You set aside the inflation front, that's an important front, and that's a front on which the news is good, although I still think the inflation rate is too high, but there's clear evidence that's coming down. And I think by the time the December figures come in, you'll see further improvement. You only have, I think, the November figures at the moment. But on the economic growth front, yes, the growth slowdown has continued. The industrial production index was very disappointing. This is clearly not going to be a very good year, although at the end of the year, it may still have a fairly good growth rate. I think what we need to focus on is not whether the growth is going to be 7.2% or 7.3% or even 7%. What we need to focus on is the quarterly slowdown going to come to a stop, and when do we begin to push it up again? I think growth is still at a level which in most countries would be regarded as fairly robust. The worry is that it's slowing down, and we need to reverse that.
Yes, but sir, why wouldn't you call it a crisis? Others aren't mincing their words. We've had Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw saying the government's in denial. Corporate India isn't mincing their words on the crisis they say India's economy is in.
Well, you know, if you get used to, or if your expectations are that we should have growth at 8.5%, and it says slow down to around 7%, you can call it a crisis if you like. But, you know, let us not forget, you know, India is not the only country in the world. And this is a very, very difficult year for the global economy. I don't think we do ourselves any good by failing to recognize that the growth slowdown that we are seeing is in a year in which certainly all the international news is negative. Now, there may also be factors that we can address and need to correct domestically, and I certainly agree with the view that there's a lot that we have to do domestically to make sure that the slowdown gets reversed. I think the government's aware of that, the government is looking at it, and I'm hoping that we will be taking some steps that will correct it. So in that sense, the notion that there's a crisis, I think results from the belief that the news is negative and the fear that government doesn't recognize it. I think that's not justified. Government is very aware of it, and we're trying to see how to reverse this.
No, but one immediate, say, domestic concern, of course, the rupee. How worried are you about that, sir? The Prime Minister met with the Reserve Bank of India governor today. Many ask why the RBI isn't intervening in the rupee slide at all.
Well, since the Prime Minister met the governor, as you say, I think I'll leave it to the governor to indicate what came out of the meeting. I don't want to speculate on what options they have and what they should do. I'm sure they're looking at all these things. As far as interest rates are concerned, I would certainly say that, you know, they would have noticed the fact that the rate of inflation is coming down. The year-on-year rate has come down, but more than that, I think if you do a seasonally adjusted assessment of what the annual rate is, it's actually much lower than the current year-on-year rate. So I think taking all those things into account, they will, I'm sure, weigh all this in their upcoming review meeting. And it's probably also true that growth is not now in the range which was earlier, if you like, above potential. Growth is actually marginally below potential. So those factors certainly suggest a different balance, particularly if the inflation news continues to be good.
No, but for instance, domestic factors, you talked about the interest rates just now, but industry has made the point that output is so low because of the high interest rates set by the RBI. They're looking forward to an interest rate cut, especially in the credit policy meet coming up later this week in Mumbai. Is that going to happen? Do you think it should happen?
No, you know, there's no doubt that a high interest rate, particularly a longer-term interest rate, discourages industrial activity. But you know, what causes the longer-term interest rate to be high is a number of things. It's not just what the Reserve Bank does on the short-term rate. So the notion that the short-term rate is determining the long-term rate with no other factors is not actually true. To the extent to which credit is scarce and interest rates are high, some of it may be due to the fact that the fiscal deficit is above target. So the solution lies in keeping the fiscal deficit under control. I think you have to look at all these things. I think it's true that at the longer term end, interest rates are on the high side. The only question is that you don't necessarily bring those interest rates down simply by operating at the short run end of the interest rate, which is the repo rate. I think too often in the press, people seem to think that all that the Reserve Bank governor has to do to bring down the long-term interest rate is to simply bring down the rate at the short end. That's not actually true. I mean, if, for example, you're absorbing too much bank credit in financing the deficit, there's going to be a shortage of credit no matter what you do. And if you expand the economy, expand credit much beyond the normal level in order to accommodate this, then you run the risk of some inflationary pressure. So you've got to balance all these factors, and I think that's what the RBI will do.
Right, but the concern, of course, sir, when you talk about steps that need to be taken and they will be taken, is the perception or the feeling that there seems to be policy paralysis in this current government, that the pause on the decision of FDI in multi-brand retail means that the government seems to have lost its way, that the reforms agenda is on hold, emergency measures have been suggested, say hold a meeting on the all-party meeting on the economy, not just the Lokpal, do things which actually don't require all-party consensus but just sheer governance, and that's where the government is failing. Ratan Tata tweeted recently that political differences, vested interests should never be allowed to stand in the way of India's economic progress.
Well, look, in a parliamentary democracy, in a political process, in order to move an agenda forward, you have to judge when is it a good time to spend a little more time building a consensus. And I think on FDI and retail, what the government has done is that they've said they'd like to work a little bit more to organize a consensus. I think it would be wrong to take the FDI decision of putting it off until a consensus is evolved. I think it would be wrong to take that as an indication of policy paralysis. It is a reflection of the fact that you have to take account of political realities. So, I mean, all the industrialists who wanted the government to do it ought to be writing to the opposition and saying, please don't oppose it, or writing to the different allies to reassure them this is actually a good thing. Now, I think with consultation, this will take place. As I said, the most important things are the global uncertainty and what it is doing to investment expectations, also what it is doing to financing expectations, the domestic impediments in the implementation of infrastructure projects, which is a purely domestic development, which I think the government should concentrate on. And of course, the macro issue that, you know, if we get too large a fiscal deficit, then it will pull money out of the real economy into financing the deficit, which is not a good thing either. So all these three things are now up on the table. I think we have to let the government sort of contemplate these and come out with a strategy to handle each of them. I think they will.
But I think the worry, sir, you mentioned fiscal deficit. Now, again, that with the food security bill perhaps coming in, it's been deferred for now. There's again worry about the fiscal deficit. Will the government stick to its current projected figure? Pessimism on Planning Commission forecasts as well on fiscal deficit, on growth, given the recent, missed forecast on inflation. Do you think regarding growth, I mean, the estimates have ranged between 7.25 and 7.5. Do you think we will actually even reach 7%, our GDP?
Look, anybody who makes a forecast is necessarily talking about uncertainty. So forecasts always have a range of error in them. And if you keep looking at, I don't believe, by the way, any forecast of the global economy last year was correct. So I think it's a bit sort of, it's unsophisticated, I think, to start sort of saying your forecast was wrong. Forecasts are often wrong, and the important thing is when it's wrong, one should admit they're wrong and explain why they're wrong, and then see whether we're making better forecasts now. I mean, look, 3 months ago I said this time inflation is going to come down. It has come down, but that's one thing you said, setting it aside, let's look at other things. So frankly, when you make forecasts, you run the risk of a forecast being wrong.
Right.
And I think you should know that. Otherwise, you get meaningless forecasts. You say forecast of inflation so much, subject to an error of 2 percentage points either way. No, so I don't think that's an issue. I think when we make forecasts, we should be constantly judging whether the forecast is right and revising it. That's, by the way, what happens everywhere in the world.
But Dr. Ahluwalia, isn't the worry that if the forecast is wrong, the entire strategy to tackle situations like inflation, fiscal deficit, etc., will also be wrong?
Sure, then you change your strategy. I mean, the important thing is when the forecast is wrong, you change your strategy. And that's exactly what we're doing. I mean, we know that the growth has slowed down. I'm sure that will feed into policy. We know that inflation is now coming down. Hopefully that will feed into policy.
Do you think, sir, finally, that we will actually reach 7%? What's your forecast on that?
Well, you know, the Finance Ministry's presentation to Parliament has given a range of 7.25 to 7.75. My own guess is that all these forecasts are made based on data available until then. The chances are that we don't know exactly, but it's much more likely to be at the lower end than the upper end.
NDTV's cricket app, Android and iPhone, fastest scorecard, special analysis, and much more. Download free. ndtv.com/apps.